So, James,
Yeah, mate.
we just spoke about tariffs recently.
Mm-hmm.
And even though you could argue that the Trump administration could be batshit crazy, some of the appointees to his administration have been quite fascinating.
Yes.
So one of those, which stood out to me, was the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard.
Yes,
who
correct.
I've heard speak many times. I think she's an interesting person.
Yep.
I think she's unique, independent, thinks for herself.
Yep.
That's a breath of fresh air for all the US administrations.
Yeah.
And you recently were just reading a paper that she put out, or her department put
Her
out.
department put out. So I wanted to say quickly to preface, Tulsi Gabbard obviously was the I believe she was a veteran. She was originally of the Democratic Party. She was the representative from Hawaii. Quick preface. And she was very vocally against the US involvement in unnecessary wars and conflicts in the Middle East.
Yep.
Famously, she actually went and met with the man himself, President Bashar al-Assad of Syria.
Yeah.
As the US is ramping up its dirty war to try and engage in some kind of diplomacy.
Yep.
She's also been critical in the past of the strikes on Yemen, for example. However, as we have seen, and as US foreign policy has continued to rumble along its destructive path, nothing has really changed since she has been the Director of National Intelligence. So, just to put that out there. So, I've recently come across this paper. So, it's a bit wordy. It's the US Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and they release their yearly assessment called the Annual Threat Assessment of the US Intelligence Community. So, to my knowledge, it's the kind of thing, it's the general consensus of the intelligence community, and that is kind of the information that is broadly distributed to like all the senators and Congress people and their staffers. To kind of create kind of a consensus
Around who the boogeyman is.
Yeah,
for
around
the
who the
US.
boogeyman is, the threats to the US,
Yeah.
and then obviously...
However imagined or real they are.
Yes, correct. However imagined or real. And obviously how to kind of like build policies and stuff off that. So I've read through the whole thing. It's about 30 pages. Anyone can find it online. Surprisingly digestible to read. I did have a few issues with just the general framing of, because it is obviously a political instrument at the end of the day.
Yes.
It's obviously the intelligence is meant to be bipartisan, but the very formation of the empire and how it functions, it's not bipartisan. Nothing. It is essentially a political tool at the end of the day. So. It represents the overall public position of the US intelligence community as it analyses the most current threats to US national security and the homeland, which is what it refers to the United States itself. So specifically in regards to non-state threats and state threats. So specifically in this year's edition, the non-state threats are Islamic terrorism, migration affecting domestic security, foreign illicit drug actors, and transnational criminal organisations, known as TCOs. But the bulk of the paper is dedicated to state actors that could potentially threaten US hegemony in the international sphere.
Can I stop you there and ask a question?
Yes, please.
Under the non-state actors, did they mention anything about climate change or environmental degradation?
No, they didn't.
Okay.
And that's going to be a part of what I'm going to be talking about.
Sorry, please continue.
So the US hegemony in the international sphere, notably China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea.
Could have guessed those, yep.
Oh, exactly, yeah. The axis of based.
Of evil.
Axis of giga chattery. Anyway, so this is from the foreword, I'm going to quote. A diverse set of foreign actors are targeting US health and safety, critical infrastructure, industries, wealth, and government. State adversaries and their proxies are also trying to weaken and displace US economic and military power in their regions and across the globe. So already, when you read that, you kind of come to the conclusion that this is being written from the perspective and the point of view of someone that has the right to be anywhere they want in the globe.
Yes.
And so therefore, when other countries asserting their dominance in said regions, that is a direct threat to you. For example, why did God put all the American oil underneath Iraqi soil? Why would he do that?
Or all the US military bases around Russia and China.
Exactly, yeah. So I'll preface this analysis by asserting that after reading the report, I couldn't help but notice the one-sidedness of their analysis as a whole. In short, the perspective taken by the authors of this paper pre-assumes that the entire globe is already under the, shall we say, noble tutelage of the US empire, and that any reduction of that position would be a catastrophic loss. Specifically when talking about various state and non-state actors threatening US interests in the region, with no mention of the threat that is faced by said actors by the imposition of US interests in the region. And also there's no mention of former US interference in these various regions and these spaces, which has directly and indirectly led to the materialization of many of these threats in the first place. So it kind of gives the reader the impression that they're like all these kind of state and non-state actors are doing what they do just because they're ineffable. It's what they do. Yep. Terrorists are terrorists because they're terrorists.
They were born like that.
They were born like that. Drug cartels are cartels because they're cartels. It's just what they are.
Yeah.
So I find that, neglecting a serious historical aspect of the research into the cause of these threats will only lead to an improper analysis, which will recommend incorrect solutions, which will only continue to compound these various threats in the future.
Yep.
So, for example, they've got a paragraph kind of dedicated to the Middle East regional instability after the fall of Assad in Syria and the establishment of the new sectarian Al-Qaeda-affiliated Hayat Tahrir al-Sham government headed by Arab Che Guevara, Ahmed al-Sharaa. However, there's not a single reference to the decades-long proxy war perpetrated by the US, Israel, and the Gulf states that actually destroyed a relatively successful regional state, killed hundreds of thousands of people, caused arguably the biggest migrant crisis in history, and ousted Assad from power. So the way I see it is, if you continue to perpetuate these same perspectives of looking at it purely from a reactionary point of view and not a proactive point of view, then this is just going to keep perpetuating itself.
Yeah.
These global crises and these global threats are going to keep perpetuating themselves.
Yeah.
So that's a constant theme that we'll find throughout the paper. But for example, I want to say as well that they talk about a threat to the United States might be, and this is where I agree with them, a threat to the United States might be China or Russia's intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are capable, but it's because they are capable of targeting the United States.
It's a legitimate military threat.
Yeah, it is. So you actually have to analyse that as a military threat. Yeah. Whereas when they talk about kind of more obscure things like, protecting shipping or protecting Israel or national interests or whatever they are, they don't. That's not a direct threat to the lives of American
US citizens.
Exactly. So just to preface, because that's kind of the theme that runs along the paper, and that's also kind of my main analytical point that I'm going to be trying to make while going over what they've presented. So in terms of illicit drug actors, which is we'll start with the non-state actors, TCOs or transnational criminal organisations are listed as a threat to US national security, specifically due to the traffic of drugs and people and to the destabilisation of the US's southern border. So according to this specific report, from October 23 to October 24, there were 52,000 deaths related to fentanyl.
Yep.
Due to obviously imported, illicit drugs, etc., etc. Now, that's an insane amount of people, but it's actually a 33% reduction from the previous 12-month period.
Yep.
So this is a quote. So they talk about the threat to the United States by the drug cartels. So Mexico-based TCOs are ramping up lethal attacks in Mexico against rivals and Mexican security forces using IEDs, including landmines, mortars, and grenades. In 2024, there were nearly 1,600 attacks on Mexican security forces using IEDs, surging from only 3 reported attacks between 2020 and 2021. The sophistication of TCO tactics is reshaping Mexico's security landscape and has heightened risk to security forces. So obviously that's Mexico's their southern border. Mexico is in a perpetual state of destabilisation, shall we say, due to their domestic situation. But there's no reference of, where do these cartels receive their weapons, their knowledge, their training? Where do they get all the money that is funded from the sales of drugs and human trafficking that allows them to perpetuate this instability? The United States has consistently interfered in Mexican affairs for the past 170 odd years. They've even had a history of training cartel groups such as the Zetas, who were supposedly a cartel kind of militia formed out of ex-Mexican army personnel, and they received training at an American military base in Texas. So,
just as a side note, I was listening to a podcast last year,
yes,
and they were talking about how a lot of the cartels go to US weapon expos and purchase all of their military equipment from the US.
Of course, and if you even want to get even more conspiratorially minded about it, which we always can, I've always got plenty of room for that, we remember the Operation Fast and Furious under the Obama administration, where it got found out that they were essentially like arming Mexican cartels with hundreds of thousands of assault rifles. And when it came out, they were like, "Oh no, we're just doing it so we can track them with the serial numbers." It's like, yeah, all right, no worries, mate, carry on. But that's the kind of thing that perpetuates. So it's not just a one-sided thing of, oh, the cartel is there, we have to fight them. It's like, no, you have to look at the root causes of these problems, because there's numerous factors that go into creating this situation. But we have to remember, like, these cartel groups are provided with an insane amount of leverage and a mechanism to assert power over Mexican politics, increase profits from weapons companies, and leverage support for American transnational companies over Mexican resources. For example, if a multinational company, most likely based in the United States, wants to, say, exploit the natural resources, the hydrocarbon resources or the rare earth resources in a specific Mexican territory, yet that Mexican territory is a majority indigenous community, and they have a degree of autonomy from the government. The Mexican government can't kick them out. The US government can't kick them out. But what a better way to depopulate an area than just to wage a violent cartel insurgency in that area. The population leaves, and look at all this land land and resources with no one here. They also talk about, in regards to the cartel, and this is a quote, China remains the primary source country for illicit fentanyl precursor chemicals and pill pressing equipment, followed by India. Mexico-based chemical brokers circumvent international controls through mislabeled shipments and the purchase of unregulated dual-use chemicals. Now, that's something that we all know. So there's a big thing in the kind of theories in the United States that's how China is trying to undermine and weaken the US, just like we did to them with the opium wars, for example. For example. However, it's interesting to note that India is almost as big a supplier as China is. There's a reason China only gets mentioned and India never gets mentioned at all. So, food for thought. And again, that's what I'm saying. This whole paper consists of statements like this that you're like, oh, it's a pretty kind of sober, kind of rational analysis, but you're looking at it, you got a whole spectrum of analysis, and you're just giving us this one tiny little bit here. I'm assuming people in the US Congress are not very smart, so maybe you don't want them to think too much. Just give them exactly what they need to know to implement the policies that perpetuate what you're doing. Another non-state actor, as has been classified, are transnational Islamic extremists.
Transnational Islamic extremists.
Man.
That's great.
So, according to this report, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their affiliate organizations are a threat to US interest in the Middle East and abroad. I wonder what those interests are. ISIS and ISIS-K have been responsible for numerous attacks across Central Asia and the Middle East, including Russia. So here is an excerpt. ISIS will seek to exploit the end of the Assad regime in Syria to reconstitute its attack capabilities, including external plotting, and to free prisoners to rebuild their ranks. So again, I'm just going to come back to, where did ISIS come from? What happened to Assad? Why is there just this fermentation ground for extremists?
There's this power vacuum that ISIS now can exploit.
Where did all these guys come from? Might have something to do with the overthrowing of Gaddafi in Libya. And then obviously the war migrated to Syria with complete backing of the West. We've had the decades-long Turkish Gulf state occupation of the Idlib province, which is where they were just training Islamic extremists for the last 10 years. So it's like, I wonder where these guys come from. But let's not think about that. Let's just focus on the threats that they could potentially pose to US interests, Israel, etc., etc. So, and it talks about how these organisations have continued to expand across North and Northwest Africa, which is posing a threat to US soldiers in the region. So it's almost as if decades of US and French occupation of these countries have actually done nothing to stop the terrorist threat.
No, of course not.
Of course not.
Yeah.
So we know famously that I believe Mali, Burkina Faso, for example, have last year or the year before, ordered the French to leave.
So these are countries in North Africa, in the Sahel region?
In the Sahel region, Northwest Africa, because they claimed that the French were not doing anything to help extremists. And lo and behold, a rise of extremism in this area. What do you know?
This is complete coincidence.
It is. It's all just masses of coincidences. So the analysis presented doesn't offer much in the nuance in its interpretation of various Islamic groups and organisations. So, for example, it puts Hezbollah on the same ideological footing as ISIS in regards to their potential to threaten US personnel and regional interests. It even makes the claim, which I've never heard, this is a real crack smoker claim, I've never heard this one before, that Al-Qaeda maintains its intent to target the United States and US citizens across its global affiliates. Its leaders, some of whom remain in Iran, have tried to exploit anti-Israeli sentiment over the war in Gaza to unite Muslims and encourage attacks against Israel. Now, I've never heard of an affiliation between Al-Qaeda and Iran. To my knowledge, they are not only obviously ideologically on opposite ends of the spectrum, but they're also political enemies.
Yes.
Al-Qaeda is a Sunni extremist group, which has, funnily enough, always worked in the interests of the United States and the Gulf states as kind of an actor that pursues their goals that align with theirs in the region. Iran has, to my knowledge, been a bulwark against that for the Shias and kind of protecting the kind of more the pan-Arab nationalists in the region, or which were a threat to US interests. So again, look, maybe there were Al-Qaeda leaders in Iran, but I've just never heard of it. I've never heard anyone else talk about it, and there's no reference to any information that they possess.
Yeah.
So, moving on. China. The strategic overview reads, this is a bit of a wordy one. President Xi Jinping and the People's Republic of China want to achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation by 2049. The PRC will seek to increase its power and influence to shape world events to create an environment favourable to PRC interests, obtain greater US deference to China's interests, and fend off challenges to its reputation, legitimacy, and capabilities at home and abroad. Beijing is deeply suspicious of US intentions and views Washington's measures against China as part of a concerted, whole-of-government effort working with US alliance and partners to contain China's development and rise, undermine CCP rule, and prevent the PRC from achieving its aims. PRC leaders are most concerned about strong unified opposition from the United States and its allies, and are responding in part by strengthening ties with partners like Russia and North Korea. At the same time, China's leaders will seek opportunities to reduce tensions with Washington when they believe it benefits Beijing, protects its core interests, and buys time to strengthen its position. Again, to me, that just sounds like that's just a really good, sober analysis. The Chinese are trying to protect their goals.
Yeah.
And by asserting themselves regionally, that is a threat to our interests because we own the entire world.
Correct.
And therefore we can't have any kind of upstarty country doing things like this and working in their own national interests. So that's, it's quite interesting.
Do you not? I've always just thought, because you mentioned it there, is that whenever you have a policy of containment, it really just highlights the hubris
it does.
Of the United States and of Australia for going along with it.
Yeah, but also the futility.
Yeah.
The futility of it as well, because, I mean... We'll get onto this a bit later on because they actually openly admit to this later on in the report. But by doing that, all you're doing is pushing all these countries further together.
Yes.
Everyone in the world, believe it or not, actually wants to get along. All the other actors want to get along with each other and have just mutual trade and disputes and abide by the UN Charter and be legitimate states. Every single country in the world wants that, apart from the US. For whatever sentiment that may be negative towards the United States at these countries, These people don't want this. I've met Chinese people. They love consumerism. They love America.
Yeah.
Iranians famously loved Americans. The Russians, after the fall of the Soviet Union, always loved Americans. It's not like there's a kind of this seething racial hatred by the yellow hordes against the pure white race encapsulated in the US, you know?
It might just be us projecting.
It might just be me projecting, maybe. But it goes, and it ends with, so this section goes over the perceived economic position, military and strategic position, and their various developments in terms of technological advancement and advancement of space technologies, critical resources and trade policy. So again, it's the kind of thing where, they're building trade alliances with other countries. This is a threat. They now have their own satellites, which means like our satellite, and telecommunication firms can't make the same amount of money.
Yeah.
That's a threat. But again, they do talk about the China's military.
Yeah.
And fair enough. They're like, they have like a shitload of nuclear weapons, which could potentially target the United States. So that's a threat. That's when you say, all right, I'm like, that's cool. That's a legitimate threat. And I understand they have them as deterrents, obviously. And they also, maybe feel the need because the Americans have thought about nuking China many times.
Yeah.
So maybe they can see why they would need that. But it ends with the statement, this is hilarious, China faces daunting challenges that will impair CCP leaders' strategic and political achievements. China's leaders probably are most concerned about corruption, demographic imbalances, and fiscal and economic struggles because they threaten the country's economic performance and quality of life, two key factors underpinning CCP legitimacy.
So national issues.
So the CCP's main issues is that they want to have like a well-managed economy and maintain a good quality of life for Chinese people. That is terribly threatening, obviously. But by continuing to assert themselves globally, and the more the US isolates them from the system and tries, like you said, to follow this policy of containment, the more China will, again, integrate and find other avenues to essentially to make the United States redundant.
Yeah.
I do have to say in this entire article, there's only 2 mentions of BRICS, which I thought was interesting.
Okay.
Only 2. I thought it would be there would be a lot more.
Yeah.
Maybe that's actually not as important.
Yeah.
Maybe
they don't see it as
US
being...
policy planners don't see it as a threat. But look, if bringing Chinese people out of poverty is a threat to US interests, I'd imagine BRICS would have to be there as well. Maybe they're just not well informed. I don't know, Jordie. They're a lot smarter than me. But can you imagine if Washington had a similar strategic outlook of, we want a stable economy and we want to bring everyone in our country out of poverty, and those are our main goals.
Yeah.
The world, again, would be a far different place.
Yeah.
Onto Russia. I'm getting there. This is a bit mouthy and it's a bit wordy, but there's a few just interesting points. They kind of say their analysis kind of says the quiet part out loud.
Yeah,
that kind of makes
come
sense.
on, the Empire has a lot of threats.
Yes, the Empire is very.
There's a reason. How many pages was this report? 40?
31 report. 31 pages.
Yeah. There's a lot of enemies to cover.
There's a lot of enemies to cover, but as well, they kind of didn't actually say much.
Yeah.
So it's 31 pages and it's quite dense. It's quite readable.
But you probably could have put the points together.
Yeah, I could have put the points together.
You could have summarised their main argument.
Yeah, so in regards to the Russian bear, the ever-present threat that has the spectre of the Slavs that has haunted Western Europe and the United States for fucking how long. This is an excerpt from their overview. Russia views its ongoing war in Ukraine as a proxy conflict with the West, and its objective to restore Russian strength and security and in its near abroad against perceived US and Western encroachment has increased the risks of unintended escalation between Russia and NATO. The resulting heightened and prolonged political military tensions between Moscow and Washington, coupled with Russia's growing confidence in its battlefield superiority and defense industrial base, and increased risk of nuclear war, create both urgency and complication for US efforts to bring the war to an acceptable close. Most Russian people continue to passively accept the war, and the emergence of an alternative to Putin is probably less likely now than at any other point in his quarter-century rule.
I wish that could have been posted 3 years ago.
Dude, can you imagine? How amazing! They're saying it out loud. Obviously, the whole purpose the Russians, for some reason they view this war against Ukraine as a proxy war. I wonder why they would view it like that.
Yeah.
The whole purpose of the proxy war in Ukraine, as we have discussed in the past, was to isolate Russia internationally, cripple them with sanctions, and create an environment where domestic opposition would overwhelm the governing party of Putin, paving the way for a leader friendlier to US and European interests.
Yes.
So they are just admitting that this whole policy has been a massive failure, but because they don't actually admit their role in said policy, then they can just kind of, they can just kind of frame it as being, it's their war with Ukraine.
Yeah.
And again, excerpt. Western efforts to isolate and sanction Russia have accelerated its investment in alternative partnerships and use of various tools of statecraft to offset US power with China's backing and reinforcement. Russia's relationship with China has helped Moscow circumvent sanctions and export controls to continue the war effort, maintain a strong market for energy products, and promote a global counterweight to the United States, even if at the cost of greater vulnerability to Chinese influence. So they're now more vulnerable to Chinese influence and less reliant on us.
It's stronger and more independent.
Yeah, so not only was our whole policy a failure, it was a massive, catastrophic failure on every single level that it was meant to, that was implemented on. Like, economically, didn't work. It's actually, in fact, probably isolated the United States more from the global south and the developing world. It has strengthened Putin. It has reinvigorated Russian nationalism and Russian military development and capabilities. Amazing. And they also, again, go on, this is quite relevant as well, Russia's interest in Greenland is focused mainly on its proximity to strategically important naval routes between the Arctic and Atlantic Oceans, including for nuclear-armed submarines and the fact that Greenland hosts a key US military base. Yeah. So they did actually mention Greenland in the China section as well.
Yep.
And they talked about, Greenland would be at risk if China were to, want to start doing business with Denmark.
Yeah.
Which again is against our national interests. But I think we've talked about this a couple of times. This will continue to become a sphere of strategic competition.
Yes,
will be Greenland and the Arctic.
Yep.
The sea routes, obviously the wealth of the natural wealth frozen under Arctic ice at the moment.
Yep. As the globe gets warmer and these sea routes start to
open
more
up.
expansive and open up.
Yeah, and that's going to change the entire game. So that, in my opinion, as we've discussed before, is kind of the driving impetus behind the whole Greenland policy and the Greenland rhetoric. What we've gleaned so far is that the Chinese government really wants to look after its people, and their weakness is threats to that.
Yes.
And we've also learnt that the United States intervention in Europe via the funding of the proxy war against Russia was a complete failure. Yes. So, again, that's about, 20 words? But that was probably about 25 pages. I wanted to move on to Iran, and this is very topical because of what's happening at the moment with perceived escalation in the region. Yeah. Obviously, the ongoing drama with the Iranian nuclear deal, the positioning of US military forces, particularly like B-2 bombers, for example. I think a third of their entire B-2 bombing fleet is within range of Iran, and like US naval carrier strike groups, which I think just one or two of these groups is like bigger than every other navy in the world combined, or all the other, like England and France's navy combined, for example. And this is very important because there's a couple points at the end that they kind of very distinctly make that are very relevant to what's happening now. So, Iran's consistently underperforming economy and societal grievances will also continue to test the regime domestically. So, first of all, let's think, why would Iran's economy be underperforming? Do you have any ideas?
Look, I would guess US sanctions.
Yes.
Could be wrong.
I think that could be a major factor. It's essentially been under a state of siege since the revolution in 1979. Yep. Obviously, you had the proxy war against Iran by Saddam Hussein of Iraq, and that was like devastating for Iran. They've since kind of rebuilt, but obviously any kind of diplomatic progress they've made with the West in regards to the original nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which was worked out under the Obama administration. Everything else has since been scuttled. So they live under crippling sanctions to the point where, like, if you get cancer, like, you can't get treatment, you just die.
Yeah.
And obviously this creates big societal issues.
And the fact that these sanctions weaken their economy is completely omitted from the report.
Exactly, of course. Another excerpt. Tehran will continue its efforts to counter Israel and press the United States to leave the region by aiding and arming its loose consortium of like-minded terrorist and militant actors, known as the Axis of Resistance. Although the demise of the Assad regime, a key ally of Tehran, is a blow to the Axis, these actors still represent a wide range of threats. These threats include some continued Israeli vulnerability to Hamas and Hezbollah, militia attacks against US forces in Iraq and Syria, and the threat of Houthi missile and UAV attacks targeting Israel and maritime traffic transitioning near Yemen.
So, can I just stop you?
Please do.
I do love how they highlight Israel's vulnerability to these actors as being like a key national security interest.
That's what I mean, dude.
For the United
States, it is.
They say the quiet part out loud.
They do, and that's the good thing about it. The only thing is, I actually don't think they realise they're saying the quiet part out loud.
Yeah.
You have to kind of read the whole report to get the kind of see the complete frame of reference that they're reporting from.
Yeah.
But I don't think they see that they are saying the quiet part out loud. This is really good, this last bit. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei continues to desire to avoid embroiling Iran in an extended direct conflict with the United States and its allies. Very important to highlight that. According to their own reports, Iran has no desire to go to war with the US and Israel. Funnily enough, because we are constantly... Although they're not doing it as much now, but they are constantly touting the threat that Iran poses to, again, American interests, Israel, European shipping lanes, whatever. They hang gays from cranes.
That was a really good BB Bananu impersonation.
So they're always posited as this threat. But as we can clearly see from their own biased and slightly cooked intelligence analysis, Iran does not want to go to war with the US. Iran seeks to target former and current US officials it believes are involved in the killing of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force Commander Qasem Soleimani in January 2020 and previously has tried to conduct lethal operations in the United States. I'm not sure about the lethal operations in the United States. There may have been one. Do you remember that before the election, Trump was talking about, he was spitballing some wild theory about an Iranian plot to assassinate him. Do you remember that?
Yeah. And the Republican senator that went on Fox News and said that there was Iranian groups with like surface-to-air missiles inside the United States. Have not heard a peep of that since then.
And then, don't forget the Iranian drone mothership.
Oh, yes. The Iranian drone mothership off the coast that was sending drones over the US.
Oh, exactly. It was the Iranian...
And that's what the UAPs were.
That's what, exactly.
Iranian drones.
It was a huge Iranian
There was no... This wasn't mentioned in the report?
It wasn't. Oh. Well, that's what I mean. There's some serious holes in their intelligence game, Jordie.
Definitely.
And, even I can gather that.
Yeah. No Iranian drones, no surface-to-air missiles.
No drone motherships. And again, it's like, they're saying, look, the Iranians are obviously pissed off because we killed Qasem Soleimani. The assassination of Qasem Soleimani is like the primary event of trauma for the Iranian public and political. It's been seared into their psyche.
It would have been like if the British murdered George Washington.
No. Do you know what it would have been like?
That's what it
would have been like if Japan flew over and drone struck Winston Churchill. If Winston Churchill was actually a good man, you know, because it was a completely illegal assassination, extraterritorial. He was on his way to like a peace conference in Iraq. You just can't let them have peace again. But of course, none of that is mentioned. So the economic, political and societal seeds of popular discontent could threaten further domestic strife akin to the wide-scale and prolonged protests inside Iran during late 2022 and early 2023. The economy is beset by low growth, exchange rate volatility and high inflation. Absent sanctions relief, these trends probably will continue for the foreseeable future. That is exactly why the sanctions have to continue and why it's very unlikely we'll get a nuclear deal. Speaking on nuclear deals, very important to note, this is actually the most key aspect to note, I think, quoting the report again. We continue to assess. Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and that Khamenei has not reauthorized the nuclear weapons program he suspended in 2003, though pressure has probably been put on him to do so. So, according to their own assessments, they not only do not want a nuclear weapon, but they have no desire to go to war with the US and Israel. They do not want to build a nuclear weapon. Yes. They don't want to. I'm not saying that they could if threatened and they needed the deterrence capacity, but they do not want to. In fact, all the countries in the Middle East have repeatedly come together numerous times to try and make the Middle East a nuclear-free zone.
Yes. So correct me
Every country in the Middle East is nuclear-free, apart from our favourite Middle Eastern country, Israel.
Yes. Because I was going to say, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Iranian government has issued a fatwa, which is like a religious doctrine, a guiding doctrine, a guiding edict that said that they cannot produce nuclear weapons.
No, because it's not in accordance with their religion, which is not actually, that's a perfectly reasonable statement, you know, killing hundreds of thousands of people in like nuclear fire is not religiously valid. No. If only the Americans would see it that way, the world, again, would be a better place. But yeah, look, so many of these factors, my whole point with this segment, by the way, so many of these factors are not properly reported. So they look at a problem and they say, this is the problem here, this is what we could do to exploit it, this is what we could do to fix it. There's no analysis of why is this problem here? Why is this a threat? Why do these people not like us? Why are these people why is the Iraqi oil, why is our oil under Iraqi sand? It makes no sense. Like, we obviously own the world, and these people asserting sovereignty is a massive threat to us. So, like, it can be seen throughout this analysis, there doesn't seem to be, and if anyone is interested, give it a read. Take you half an hour. It's nothing crazy. It's not too, I've read far worse things. Like, it can be seen that throughout this analysis, there doesn't seem to be any consideration of the second order of effect of past policies and how these directly threaten the security of the US today. I would argue that all of these threats in their present form, whether it's drug cartels, domestic destabilization, the fallout from the Russia-Ukraine war, simmering tensions with China in Asia, and the destruction of the Middle East, are all partially attributable to US policy in these regions in the past. Not only that, but there's no attempt to rationalise or humanise these other adversary nations and consider their actions as a rational response to the hegemonic subjugation that they have been subjected to in the past. So I worry that without proper analysis to create long-lasting, multilateral and mutually beneficial solutions, the threats in their current form to the US homeland and to their strategic interests will not only remain but also continue to grow, further harming the US's position in the world and leading to further conflict, destruction and deprivation of various regions around the world. But, Jordie, maybe that is the whole point.
Succinct and eloquent, James.
I'll leave it at that.
That was gorgeous. I do have to, before we start, I do have to pressure this one more time. So, climate change, environmental degradation.
None of those are threats.
Refugee crisis because of climate change. None of these things mentioned.
You can't sanction the environment, dude.
So
you can't bomb, like, you can't do a insane, like, yeehaw America Operation Rolling Thunder on greenhouse gases, bro.
So so climate change wasn't mentioned at all. It's completely omitted from the report.
Well, this report is it's the annual threat assessment of the US intelligence community. Okay. So, but that shows you. Now, I know for a fact in the US intelligence community, obviously it's like a huge portion of their state. And obviously there are very intelligent people. There are people that are much smarter than me that are working there. There are people that know this is the case. Like all the points I've made and all the contradictions I've pointed out, there are people that know this. But my only conclusion is that by perpetuating this specific worldview, which is going to lead to only a certain way of resolving these problems, it is just going to keep the cycle rolling.
It allows the cycle to reproduce itself.
Yes, of course.
All right. Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you for that.
You're welcome, Matt.